I saw their reflection in the bar mirror before I understood what I was looking at. My name is Daniel. I'm 41 years old. I'm an architect. And until that Thursday evening in October, I believed, genuinely, without irony, that I had built something solid. Not perfect. Solid. The kind of life that doesn't make headlines but holds weight. A house with good bones on Redwood Drive. A 9-year-old son who still wanted to show me his drawings. 11 years of marriage to a woman I thought I knew down to the way she held her coffee cup with both hands even in summer. I wasn't supposed to be at Harlow's that night. That's the part that still catches me sometimes. The randomness of it. Jason had texted around 6, asking if I wanted to grab a drink after his meeting downtown fell apart. I almost said no. I had drawings to review, a site report half finished on my desk, and that particular tiredness that comes not from working hard but from working without end. But something made me say yes. Maybe I was tired of my own company. Maybe I just needed to hear a voice that wasn't filtered through a screen. Cara had called at 5:30, cheerful and slightly rushed the way she got when she was already mentally somewhere else. She told me she was going to Renata's, her friend from the gym, a name I'd heard enough times that it had stopped meaning anything specific to me. She said not to wait up, that they might do dinner after, that Owen's lunch was already packed in the fridge. She said it the way you say things you've rehearsed without realizing you've rehearsed them. I told her fine. I told her to have fun. I didn't ask what time she'd be home. Looking back now, that was the first thing I should have noticed. Not a red flag exactly, but a texture. The call was smooth in a way that real spontaneous plans never quite are. Fort Collins in October has a particular quality of light at dusk. Low and amber, the kind that makes everything look slightly more cinematic than it is. Jason was already at the bar when I arrived, halfway through a beer, scrolling his phone with the focused blankness of a man avoiding his own thoughts. We ordered. We talked about his project in Boulder, about Owen's soccer season, about a renovation bid I'd lost to a firm in Denver that undercut me by $30,000. Normal conversation, the kind that fills space without demanding anything. I was facing the back of the room. Jason was facing the door. We were 40 minutes in, the second round almost gone, when I looked up at the mirror behind the bar, one of those long antique ones with a slight warp that makes everything in the reflection look like it belongs to a slightly different world. And there she was, Cara, sitting at a table near the far window, laughing at something the man across from her had just said. Not the polite laugh she gave at work functions. The real one, head tilted back, hand briefly touching her collarbone. The man, dark jacket, close-cropped hair, leaning forward with his elbows on the table, said something else and she leaned in too. I didn't move. I didn't breathe differently. I just watched the reflection for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably 4 seconds. Something tightened in my chest. Not pain yet, more like the moment before pain, when the body knows before the mind catches up. I remember thinking, with strange calm, she said Renata's. The thing about a marriage at 11 years is that you stop seeing it the way a stranger would. You stop seeing it at all, in a way. You see the schedule, the routines, the logistics. You see who picks up Owen on Tuesdays, who calls the plumber, whose turn it is to stay up when the boy has a fever. The texture of daily life becomes so familiar that you mistake familiarity for closeness. I was good at the architecture of our life together, the structure of it. I made sure the bills were paid, the house was maintained, the vacations were planned in reasonable advance. What I wasn't good at, what I see now with the clarity of someone who has paid for the blindness, was the interior. I built the walls and laid the floors and forgot to ask whether the person living inside was warm. Cara worked at a mid-sized marketing firm called Pinnacle Group, had for 6 years. She'd moved up steadily, account coordinator to senior manager, a trajectory she was quietly proud of in the way that people are proud of things they earned without help. The job had started consuming more of her evenings over the past year. Late calls, presentations due Monday, team dinners I was invited to and then uninvited from as plans shifted. I accepted each change as it came because that is what I did. I accepted. I smoothed. I did not push on doors that seemed only slightly closed. There was a night in late August, about 7 weeks before the bar, when I came to bed after midnight and she was already asleep. I stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her. She was facing away from me, her breathing slow and even. And I had a thought that I immediately dismissed because it was the kind of thought that felt disloyal to even form. I don't know what she's thinking about anymore. I got into bed. I didn't touch her. I stared at the ceiling for a while and then fell asleep, and in the morning made coffee and packed Owen's lunch, and the thought was gone. That was the moment I should have paid attention to. Not because the thought was correct, I didn't know then what it meant, but because I chose in real time to walk away from my own instinct. I filed it under stress and busy season and every other reasonable explanation that kept the surface undisturbed. I had gotten so skilled at choosing the comfortable interpretation that I'd stopped noticing I was making a choice at all. The first concrete thing I noticed and then talked myself out of, was the phone. Cara had always been relaxed about her phone. Left it on the counter on the coffee table, face up. A person comfortable in her own transparency. Sometime around September that changed. The phone started coming with her when she left a room. Not dramatically, not clutched or hidden. Just present. Always near. I registered it once, thought and moved on. The second thing was a name. Mark. She mentioned him in passing sometime mid-September, a new account lead at Pinnacle, brought in from the Denver office, apparently sharp and slightly difficult in the way that competent people sometimes are. She mentioned him neutrally, the way you mention a new appliance. Functional. Noted. I didn't think about it again. Owen was the one who said something, though he couldn't have known what he was saying. We were at the kitchen table on a Sunday, him doing a worksheet, me going through sketches. Cara was getting ready upstairs for what she described as a team brunch. Owen looked up from his worksheet and said, without preamble, "Mom was on the phone really late last night. I heard her laughing." He said it the way 9-year-olds report things, as fact without editorial weight. Then he went back to his worksheet. I said, "Probably work stuff, buddy." He nodded, unconvinced in the distracted way children are unconvinced, and kept writing. I didn't bring it up with Cara. I told myself it was nothing, but I hadn't heard her laugh like that in the house in a while, the Real laugh unguarded, and something about that detail stayed on the edge of my thoughts like a word you can't quite remember. The night before the bar, she came home from what she said was a client event, smelling faintly of something I didn't recognize. Not perfume, but the particular olfactory blurriness of a room full of people and warmth and drinks. She kissed me on the cheek in the kitchen, said the event ran long, asked if Owen was asleep. I said yes. She said great. She was exhausted, and went upstairs. I stood in the kitchen for a moment after she left. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on Redwood Drive. I wasn't suspicious. I was just still, as if something had asked a question I hadn't heard clearly enough to answer. I didn't confront her at the bar. That's the first thing people want to know, usually. Why didn't you walk over? Why didn't you say something? But here's what I understood in those 4 seconds of watching the mirror. If I walked over and she had an explanation, a client I'd never met, a work thing she'd forgotten to mention, I would look paranoid and she would know I'd been checking. And if she didn't have an explanation, I would be having the worst conversation of my life in a public place with my best friend 20 feet away, and I would have nothing. No certainty, no footing, nothing but a feeling and a reflection in a slightly warped antique mirror. So I looked away. I said something to Jason about the Denver firm. I finished my drink. I checked the mirror twice more. She was still there, still laughing. And then I told Jason I was tired and needed to get back to Owen. He didn't question it. I paid, we left through the front, and I walked to my car in the cold October air with my hands in my jacket pockets and my thoughts moving very carefully, like a man crossing ice. She came home at 11:17. I know because I was awake, reading the same paragraph of a novel for the 4th time, and I heard the garage door. She came upstairs smelling of cold air and faint wine, changed in the bathroom, slid into bed. She said Renata sent her love. She said the risotto was excellent. She described the restaurant, a place called Fiorella on Mountain Avenue, with enough specific detail that for one unstable moment I almost believed it. Then I thought about the bar mirror, and the risotto dissolved. "Good night," I said. "Good night," she said. She was asleep in 10 minutes. I lay there in the dark doing what I always did instead of acting. I reasoned. I built alternative structures. Maybe he was a client she'd bumped into. Maybe the team brunch had continued into the evening. Maybe I had misidentified her in a warped mirror after 2 beers and a long week. I was, after all, a man who had spent 11 years choosing the interpretation that kept the peace. But I had seen the laugh. Over the next 10 days, I began paying attention the way I should have been paying attention for months. Not frantically, quietly, methodically, the way I approached a structural problem at work. I noted things. The phone, always near. The Thursday evenings that now ended slightly later than before, with explanations that were always plausible and always slightly over-detailed. A new gym bag that appeared in the back of her car, though she mentioned the gym less, not more. A work name, Mark, that stopped appearing in her conversation at exactly the point when I started listening for it. There was a Tuesday evening when Owen asked her to help with a geography project, a map he was drawing. She sat with him for about 15 minutes, then her phone buzzed and she excused herself, said she'd be back, and didn't come back for 40 minutes. Owen finished the map on his own. He didn't seem bothered. Children adapt faster than we give them credit for. But I watched from the hallway and I felt something I wasn't ready to name. I wasn't afraid of losing her, I told myself. I was afraid of being wrong. There's a crucial difference, and I spent considerable energy maintaining it. But beneath that, deeper in the place I didn't look at directly, was a much simpler and more devastating fear that I already knew and had known for some time and had chosen not to. One evening I searched Pinnacle Group's team page. Mark Hadley, Senior Account Director, Denver. The photo showed a man in his early 40s, dark jacket, composed expression. Professional, forgettable objectively. But I stared at that photo for longer than I should have, trying to find in his face whatever Cara was finding in it, and coming up empty. I closed the laptop. Owen was in the next room, watching something on his tablet, and I could hear the distant sounds of whatever animated world he'd retreated into, and the normalcy of it, the small domestic warmth of it, hit me somewhere unprotected. That was the moment I stopped convincing myself I might be wrong. I want to be honest about this part, about what I did and what it cost me. I am not, by nature, an investigative person. I don't have a suspicious mind. I have a mind that prefers clarity, structure, things that can be drawn on paper and load-tested and revised. What I was doing over those 2 weeks felt foreign to my own psychology. Felt like borrowing someone else's methods to solve a problem I'd never wanted to have. I started with what I could access without crossing lines I wasn't prepared to cross. Our shared calendar. Location sharing on the family app we'd set up 2 years ago for Owen. The one Cara had suggested herself. So we always knew where the other was if something happened to Owen and only one of us was reachable. I hadn't looked at it in months. On a Wednesday, Cara said she was working late. The location app showed her phone at an address on Linden Street. I looked up the address. It was a restaurant called the Copper Rail, not Pinnacle Group's offices, which were on College Avenue. She came home at 9:30, said the team had decided to debrief over dinner after a client call ran long. She was relaxed and detailed and entirely convincing. I said nothing. I smiled and asked how the client call went. She said, "The usual circus." Mark kept the client calm, which honestly was impressive. It was the first time she'd said his name in my presence in over 3 weeks. She said it neutrally, footnote style, and immediately moved on to asking about Owen's soccer practice. I noted both the name and the recovery speed, the practiced pivot, and said nothing. The following Saturday, Jason came by to watch a game. He knew something was wrong. Jason has always had a radar for the things I don't say, a function of 20 years of friendship. He watched me through the first half with the careful patience of someone waiting for a door to open. At halftime, I told him about the bar, about the mirror, about the 10 days since. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know yet. I said I needed to be certain before I did anything. He nodded slowly. He did not tell me I was paranoid. He did not offer alternative explanations. That, more than anything, told me something. What Jason did say, quietly, near the end of the evening, was this: "She was at Harlow's last Thursday too." I didn't think anything of it because I didn't know she'd said she was somewhere else. I saw her when I was parking. She was walking in with a man. He looked at his beer. Dark jacket. Tall. I sat with that for a long time after he left. The red herring came in the form of Leah. Cara's sister had been having a difficult year. A separation, a job change, a slow unraveling that Cara had been more present for than she'd let on to me. I discovered this not through Cara but through a call I happened to overhear. Cara in the back garden, voice low and careful. "You can't keep doing this to yourself, Leah. You have to tell him." I heard that and for one vertiginous moment thought the conversation was about me. My chest contracted. I stood in the kitchen doorway with a glass of water and rearranged my entire understanding of the past 6 weeks. Cara was covering for Leah, not herself. The secret was her sister's, not hers. I almost let myself believe it. I wanted to believe it. That's the truth I have to sit with. I wanted an exit from what I already knew, and Leah handed me one, and I took it for almost 4 days. 4 days of sleeping more easily, of watching Cara across the dinner table with something closer to affection than suspicion. Then on a Tuesday morning, when Cara thought I was in the shower, I saw her phone screen light up on the bathroom counter. One message, one name, Mark. 3 words visible in the preview. Last night was. The screen went dark before I could read the rest. I got in the shower. I stood under the water for a long time. The Leah theory dissolved. The alternative structures collapsed. What remained was simple and structural and load-bearing. My wife is having an affair with Mark Hadley. I did not reach for her phone. I want to be clear about that. Not because I'm proud of the restraint, but because the clarity I now had didn't need the rest of that sentence. 3 words were enough to confirm what a bar mirror had shown me 3 weeks earlier. What I did instead was plan. I am an architect. A plan. I chose a Friday evening 3 days later. Owen was at his friend Cooper's for a sleepover, arranged by me quietly, a week in advance. I wanted the house to ourselves. Not for drama. For space. Cara came home at 6:40. She was in good spirits or performing good spirits with her usual competence. There was a time when I couldn't tell the difference, and I'm still not entirely sure which it was. She set her bag on the kitchen island, asked about Owen, said she was thinking of ordering Thai food. I said Owen was at Cooper's. I said I'd already eaten. I said, "Sit down, Cara. I want to talk to you." Something moved across her face. Not fear exactly, more like recalibration. The way a person looks when they suddenly understand which room they've walked into. She sat. I sat across from her. I had no folder of printed screenshots, no dramatic reveal. I had the location app, the bar mirror, Jason's account, the phone preview, and 3 weeks of a careful mind doing what careful minds do when they stop avoiding. I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Not kind, not careful, honest. Where were you the Thursday 3 weeks ago when you said you were at Renata's?" She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I was at Renata's." I nodded slowly. "You were at Harlow's bar on Mason Street. You walked in with Mark Hadley. You sat at the window table. You were there when I arrived to meet Jason at 6:30, and you were there when I left at 8. The silence that followed was complete. Then, and this is where it shifted, where the scene became something I hadn't anticipated. She didn't break. She didn't confess. She tilted her chin up slightly and said, "You were watching me. I saw you in the mirror. You could have come over. You chose not to." Her voice was measured, controlled. "Why? Because I wanted to understand what I was seeing. Or because you wanted evidence," she said. "Because you've been building a case, Daniel. That's what you do. You don't talk, you don't ask, you just observe and plan and wait for the right moment. You've been doing that for 11 years. I looked at her across the kitchen table. I recognized what she was doing. I'd read enough about human behavior in difficult conversations to name the mechanism, and I made a decision not to follow her into that argument because that argument was not the question I had come to answer. "Is something happening between you and Mark?" I asked. A long pause. Something in her face moved. Something real underneath the composure. "It's not what you're making it sound like." "What is it, then?" She stopped. She looked at her hands on the table. When she looked up again, there were no tears, just a kind of exhausted clarity, as if she had been carrying a weight and had suddenly decided to set it down without ceremony. "He listens to me. That's where it started. He actually listens. And where did it go from there?" She didn't answer immediately. I waited. I am good at waiting. It is perhaps the most useful thing conflict avoidance ever taught me. It went somewhere it shouldn't have, she said finally. How long? For months. I absorbed that. For months. I ran through 4 months of dinners, school pickups, Sunday mornings, our anniversary dinner at the Italian place on Riverside. All of it now double exposed, the real image and the hidden one superimposed. Did you want to leave me? I asked. Or is this something you were doing while staying? She looked at me with something that might have been respect or guilt or both. I didn't want to leave you, she said. I wanted to feel. I wanted someone to see me. You stopped seeing me, Daniel. I don't know when exactly, but at some point I became part of the structure. The house, the schedule, Owen's lunch in the fridge. I wasn't a person to you anymore. I was a function. There was a part of me, the honest part, that did not dismiss this entirely. Because I had built the life and forgotten to inhabit it, and I knew that, and she knew I knew. Some of what she said was true. Not all of it, but enough. You could have told me that, I said. I tried. Her voice was quieter now. A year ago, 2 years ago. You'd listen, you'd nod. You'd say we'd do better. And then nothing changed. Not because you didn't love me, because you didn't know how to change. And I stopped asking. So you stopped asking and started something else. She didn't deny it. That's not a justification, I said. That's an explanation. I want to be clear that I hear the difference. The rest of the conversation was slower, more technical in a way that felt strange, almost like a deposition. I asked questions. She answered them. Not all the answers were complete. I suspected she was giving me a managed version, and I didn't push past it because what I needed to know I already knew, and the rest was detail. At some point she said, "What happens now?" I said, "I don't know yet." She nodded. She looked very tired. She was still beautiful in that moment in the way that familiar things are beautiful. Not because of what they are now, but because of what they accumulated over time, and that made it worse, not better. I stood up. I said I was going to stay at Jason's for the weekend. I said Owen would be home Sunday afternoon and that things should be normal for him. She said of course. She said she was sorry. She said it simply, without the architecture of a defense, and in that simplicity I believed her. I picked up my keys and my overnight bag, which I had packed that morning, and I walked out. The door closed behind me very quietly. Jason's couch was not comfortable. He knew it and apologized for it with the particular guilt of a man whose apartment reflects a different set of priorities than married life. I told him it was fine. I lay on that couch Friday night and Saturday night and most of Sunday morning, watching the light change on his ceiling, doing something I had not done in a very long time. Nothing. No plan forming. No structure being assembled. Just the flat, open experience of what had happened, moving through me like weather. Owen came home Sunday afternoon, bright and disheveled from Cooper's, full of stories about a video game I'd never heard of. He hugged me at the door. He smelled of someone else's house, that particular mix of different laundry detergent and unfamiliar food, and I held on for a moment longer than usual. He didn't notice or didn't mind. The weeks that followed were a particular kind of quiet. Cara and I moved through the house like two people carefully navigating a room full of things that could break. We were civil. We were, for Owen's sake, warm in his presence. At night we lay on our respective sides of a bed that had never felt so precisely divided. I contacted a family lawyer named Patricia Odom in mid-November. Not because I had decided, because I needed to understand the terrain before I made any decision on it. That is how my mind works, map first, then move. Cara found out through a shared credit card statement, the lawyer's retainer. She came to me in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening, statement in hand, and said, "Is this what we're doing?" I said I didn't know yet, but I said it differently than I had on the night of the confrontation, with less openness in it. She nodded once and went upstairs. For 3 weeks after that, she tried. I want to say that honestly because honesty requires it. She tried. She was present in a way she hadn't been in over a year. She was home for dinner every evening. She was attentive to Owen, to me, to the small things that accumulate into a life. She ended whatever she had with Mark. She told me this and I believed her because I checked the location app twice and her phone had stopped going with her into other rooms. And still something in me would not open back up. I spent time understanding why. It wasn't pride or punishment or the satisfaction of withholding. It was something quieter and more structural. The recognition that what she had described, feeling invisible, unheard, unseen, was real, and that my response to it had been to hear her now, finally, with devastating clarity, but only because the cost of not hearing had become impossible to ignore. I was capable of seeing her. I had simply required a catastrophe to start. That is its own kind of failure, not as dramatic as hers, but no less consequential. We had one more conversation in December after Owen was in bed. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same positions as the confrontation, and she said she wanted to know if there was any path forward. Not a demand, an honest question. I thought about it for a while. I thought about 11 years, and Owen's face when we were both in the same room, and the way the house felt full in a way it wouldn't without her. Then I thought about the bar mirror, the laugh, the 4 months, the Tuesday morning and the phone screen and the 3 words I'd never finished reading. I thought about the Leah theory and how badly I'd wanted it to be true and what that wanting had cost me in terms of knowing myself. I don't think I can, I said. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully categorize. Grief, maybe, or recognition, and then she nodded slowly. Okay, she said. I understand. We filed in January. The process was quiet, as these things go, no courtroom drama, no contested assets turned into weapons. We structured it around Owen. 2 homes within the same school district, consistent routine, neither of us weaponizing him against the other. Patricia Odom said we were the most functional divorcing couple she'd worked with in years. I didn't find that particularly comforting, but I took it. Cara came by in February, after the papers were signed, after she'd moved into an apartment on Mulberry Street, on a Sunday afternoon. Owen was there. She picked him up for a matinee, and at the door she looked at me for a moment and said, "I'm sorry, Daniel, for what it's worth." I said, "I know." She nodded and took Owen's hand and they walked to her car, and I stood in the open doorway watching them go, and the February air came in cold and clean, and after a moment I closed the door. Not because I was done being in pain, but because I was done waiting for the pain to tell me who I was. The house is quieter now on the nights Owen is with Cara. I've gotten used to it in the way you get used to things, not because they stop hurting, but because you build a different relationship with the silence. I work late sometimes. I cook more than I used to. I've started having the conversations I used to avoid, which is a small thing, but it is a real one. Owen asked me once, on a Friday evening when Cara was getting him for the weekend, whether people stopped loving each other. I thought about how to answer. I said that sometimes people change in ways that take them to different places, and that doesn't mean the love was false. It means people are complicated and sometimes love isn't enough to close the distance. He thought about this. "But you still love me," he said. "Yes," I said. "That's a different kind of love. That one doesn't have a different place to go." He seemed satisfied with this. He grabbed his overnight bag and went out to Cara's car. I stood in the kitchen and the house was still, and outside the Colorado sky was doing that thing it does in early spring, stretching wide and clear and faintly promising, and I thought, I built the wrong things for a long time. I can build different things now. It wasn't happiness. It was something more honest than happiness. It was enough to start with. Cara didn't leave the marriage on the night of the confrontation. She left it much earlier, somewhere in the long middle stretch of years when she stopped asking and he stopped noticing that she'd stopped asking. That is the quiet devastation at the center of this story. Not the affair, but what preceded it. The affair was the visible fracture. The erosion was invisible and slow and entirely mutual in its architecture. Daniel was a man who had mastered the maintenance of surfaces. He knew how to keep a marriage functioning, the bills, the schedule, the logistics, without ever examining whether the person inside it was still fully present. His conflict avoidance, which he likely understood as patience or stability, was in practice a way of never letting anything cost him. He never pushed on a closed door. He never asked the uncomfortable question. He chose, repeatedly and consciously, the interpretation that preserved the peace, and each time he made that choice, he ceded a small amount of intimacy without realizing it was finite. What Cara described in the confrontation, feeling like a function rather than a person, deserves serious examination, not as justification but as information. Because the tragedy is not that she was lying when she said she tried to tell him. She wasn't. She had tried. The tragedy is that Daniel's way of responding to her attempts, present in the moment, then unchanged afterward, taught her, over years, that communication with him had no consequence. That speaking her need produced empathy but not change. And eventually she stopped speaking the need and started looking for a different answer elsewhere. None of this excuses the deception. The lie sustained over 4 months, the Renata cover stories, the managed phone, the perfectly calibrated details, that was a sustained act of will. It required daily decisions to continue. It required a compartmentalization that, whatever its psychological origins, still constitutes a deliberate choice. Understanding why Cara arrived at that choice is not the same as releasing her from it. What the story ultimately illuminates is something about the specific danger of comfortable distance. Daniel and Cara were not an unhappy couple in any obvious way. They weren't fighting. They weren't cold. They were competent and functional and going in the same direction, which is sometimes the most dangerous condition a marriage can be in, because it removes the urgency to examine whether two people are actually still reaching for each other. The accumulation of small silences, his unasked questions, her stopped attempts, his preference for surface stability, her turn toward someone who offered her the simplest thing, attention, built a gap that neither of them named until it was unbridgeable. And once the gap was bridged by someone else, the original architecture couldn't hold the new weight. Daniel's decision not to reconcile was not a punishment. It was a structural assessment. He was honest enough with himself to recognize that his response to her pain, genuine now, finally clear, was the same response he had always been capable of. He had heard her for years and changed nothing. The crisis made him hear her differently, but he couldn't guarantee that crisis was the only thing that would keep him listening. And she deserved more than a man who required catastrophe to pay attention. What he takes forward is not bitterness. It is a specific and hard-won knowledge that love without presence is maintenance, that choosing peace over difficulty is not the same as choosing connection, that a person can be quietly leaving a marriage for years before they find the door. What stays with me, thinking about Daniel and Cara, is not the betrayal itself. It's the years before it, all those small moments when something true could have been said and wasn't, a question not asked, a silence accepted, a discomfort smoothed over into another ordinary evening. We tend to look at infidelity as the story, but sometimes it's just the last chapter of a story that started much earlier, written in missed conversations and ignored instincts and the gradual, gentle decision to stop asking whether the person next to you is still really there. The hardest thing isn't loving someone. It's staying curious about them. That's the thing we let slide first, and the thing that costs us most in the end.